Welcome to Jacob and His Children, A Journey Through Genesis, a continuation of Rabbi Silber's Parsha Shir, not Parsha Shir, Bereshit Shir that's been going on for the past couple of Zmanim. If you have a Tanakh of your own, you're welcome. Please feel welcome to keep it open to the end of Genesis 40. Otherwise, we'll be sharing Pesukim from Sfaria on the screen. You can follow along that way. If you're joining on Zoom, just one small matter of housekeeping, please mute yourself if you're not directly asking a question. Otherwise, we get audio feedback and distortion and weird artifacts. I am sending around panelist invitations. And with that, Rabbi Silber, I believe the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're up to the end of chapter 40. We have Joseph finds himself in jail, and he has interpreted the dreams of the two officers of Pharaoh, Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Ophim. He has given the Sarah Mashkim a favorable interpretation. Essentially, you'll be restored to your post. And when the Sarah Ophim hears this favorable interpretation, he at that point says, why don't you tell me, I'll tell you my dream. You can interpret that as well. And of course, his dream has a negative interpretation, namely that at this 3 days later, Paro's birthday party, he restores the Sarah Hamashkim and he will execute the Sarah Ophim. That's what Joseph essentially says to them, and that's what happens at the end of chapter 40. After Joseph interprets the dream of the butler, the Sarah Mashkim, and that's found back in chapter 40 in verses, the interpretation begins in verse number 12. He interprets 12 and verse 13. He says you're going to be restored to your former post. And then he says in verse number 14, Ki im zechartani itcha kasher yitavrach v'yasit lo imodi chesed v'zkartani el paro v'otzeitani min habayit hazeh. So he says, this does not seem to be an interpretation of the dream. This seems to be separate from that, a request from the Sarah Mashkim, namely, that since you will be restored to your posts and it'll be good for you. So when in fact this interpretation is proven to be true, I ask you please to remember me and to Paro. Remember me when it's good for you, and be kind to me. Mention me to Paro, his kartani, and get me out of this place. And then he asks, for I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, that was Joseph's request of the Sarah Mashkim. And the end of the chapter, after, in fact, what Joseph predicted comes true. But the last verse of chapter 40 is V'lo zachar Sarah Mashkim et Yosef vayishkocheyu. The cupbearer, the Sarah Mashkim, did not think of Joseph, he forgot him. It's hard to imagine why he didn't think of Joseph or didn't remember him. You're talking about 3 days later. You're not talking about something that happened many years ago, but nonetheless, he doesn't remember Joseph, he forgets him. I just wanted to repeat what I may have mentioned last week. I mentioned certainly in the past. I think it's a very important point, and that is that later, and we're going to go through Paro's dreams, but after Paro has his dreams, and he tells his dreams, we are told, this is in chapter 41 already, he tells his dreams to his Chartumim and Chachamim. Chartumim, they usually translate as magicians. Chachamim, we know, are the wise men. But it says, Ein poter otam leFaro, none could interpret them for Pharaoh. So nobody is giving an interpretation, or at least an interpretation that Paro is happy with. Rashi interprets Ein poter otam leFaro. The leFaro for Rashi is not to Paro, but rather none could interpret in a way that was for Paro. That is to say, none could interpret the dream in a way that's beneficial to Paro. I'll come back to that. In any event, be that as it may, so nobody is able to interpret Paro's dreams, not his wise men, not his Chatumim, not his Chachamim. It's at that point that the Sarah Mashkim speaks up. He didn't speak up 3 days afterwards, but now he speaks up. So let's take a look briefly at that verse. It's Pasuk Tet, verse number 9. He begins to speak. Vayedaber Sarah Mashkim et Paro lemor, et chatoai ani maskir hayom. He says to Paro, I am mentioning a maskir. I will make mention of my sin today. Up to this point, he didn't mention the sin. He doesn't want to tell Paro that he was in jail. Obviously, he was in jail, but why harp on that? So 3 days later, he doesn't mention anything about Joseph. He's happy to have his job back. Forgets Joseph. But now, suddenly, 2 years later, a full 2 years later, suddenly, he's mentioning the sin. And now he explains, says, Paro katzaf alav adav, vayitein oti b'mishmar beit tzara tabachim, oti v'yetzar ha'ofim. He says Paro got angry against his servants. It sounds like in general. He was angry. Something was not proper. The servants were not in Paro's good graces. He got angry. And he placed himself, the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophim, the chief baker, he placed them in jail. You put me in Mishmar, in the holding pen of the Sarah Tabachim, together with Sarah Ophim. And now he tells the story. And on one night, same night, both of us had dreams. Each one had a different interpretation, presumably. And there was with us a Hebrew slave to the Sarah Tabachim, the chief butcher. And we told him our dream, and he interpreted our dreams for us. Ish kachalomo potar, and he gave an appropriate interpretation for each dream, 2 different interpretations. And what he said came true. Oti Yeshiva al-Kani, he, Pharaoh, third person, restored me to my post. V'yoto Tolah, and he, the other guy, the chief baker, he was hanged. Oto Tolah. So this is when the Sarah Mashkim remembers. It's 2 years later. 3 days later, he forgets. 2 years later, he remembers. So I'll make a couple of points about this. The first point is that he remembers at a time when it serves his purposes to remember. And it serves his purposes in chapter 41, because in chapter 41, Paro wants help. He's consulted all the magicians and all the wise men. Nobody can satisfy Paro. Nobody can help Paro. And the Sarah Mashkim sees an opportunity to strengthen his bond with Paro by telling him of somebody who can help him. Your wise man can help you, but I happen to remember now. So he remembers when it suits him to remember. That's the important point over here. I'll pick up with this point later. He remembers when it's for his own benefit. It benefits him to remember. It didn't benefit him 2 years ago when Joseph was in jail and interpreted the dreams. What profit is there in mentioning Joseph to Paro? I mean, what does he benefit from that? Nothing. It's the right thing to do, but he doesn't care. But now there actually is a benefit, because he's the one that's going to help Paro out. And the magicians can't, and the wise men can't, but the Sarah Mashkim can. That's one point. We'll come back to this point again. It's a very central point. That's point number one. Let me just pick up with this point. Now, this particular point about we'll make a different point. The second point I wanted to make was that you see, when he speaks, you see the extent to which the fact that the other guy was hanged is significant. The Sarah Mashim could have said, I had a dream 2 years ago, or whatever it was, and there was some fellow with us in jail, young guy, slave, and he interpreted my dream, and he was 100% correct. But he actually doesn't say just that. He actually mentions the situation of the Sarah Ophim, of the chief baker. And that had an impact on him. I said last week that Joseph's interpretation of the baker is much more significant than the interpretation of the butler. Because the interpretation of the butler, he doesn't lose anything if he's wrong. Let's say he's wrong and Paro executes the butler. Okay, so he's dead. So, but if he spares the baker, and the baker, and this is important, the baker, these are people of important positions in the government, not just the baker. He's the Sarah Ophim, he's the Sarah Mashkim, he's the Sarah Tabachim. These are I'll come back to this point about the Sarah Ophim in particular. He's a person in charge of the lechem. And one might say in charge of the economy. He's in charge of, the lechem is the key, the key product in the whole story of Joseph is going to be lechem. So Paro was forced to execute the person in charge of the lechem. That means that Paro doesn't have control of the lechem. That's a critical point. I'll get to that. But my point about the butler is what impresses him is that Joseph gave two different interpretations, and the interpretation of the baker is much more significant because the baker is taking a risk when he says the baker, you're going to be killed. Because if the baker is restored and not killed, then you have a mortal enemy very high up in the government. So the fact that Joseph was able to give two different interpretations to two different people, even though they had similar dreams on the same night, that also will be important because what Joseph's interpretation of Paro's dream will deal with the issue, are we talking about one dream or two dreams? That's a very central issue, which we'll come to shortly. I did want to mention that the idea of not having a memory, that there's no memory. Memory means that you take into account a context. You take into account the past. The Mitzrayim is not a place of memory. Mitzrayim is, in the words of the Torah, you see it and you take it. That's the first experience with Paro in Mitzrayim back in chapter 12 in Lech Lecha. When they see you, they will kill me and take you. And when Joseph speaks to Mrs. Potiphar in chapter 39, when she propositions him, and his point is, how could I do this? Your husband's been so good to me. He's supported me. He trusts me. But those concepts don't factor in because she sees Joseph. That is to say, she sees him at this moment, and the past to her is quite irrelevant. It's what you want at this moment. So that's Mitzrayim. And of course, the one who understood this perfectly is the person that wrote Megillat Esther. Because Megillat Esther, this point is very central. The king, Achashverosh, he has a very selective memory. Mordechai saved his life. Mordechai informed the king through Esther that there were two people out there, Bigaton and Teresh, who were out to assassinate the king. They pointed out that Bigton and Teresh probably means wine and bread. It's similar to the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophim, but the two of them are on the same side. But in any event, after Mordechai tells Esther about the plot, and Esther tells the king, and it turns out it's true, and they are hanged, and it's written down in the book of records. That's what it says in the Megillah. Sefer Divrei Hayamim Asher Amel. The king has a record book, and it's in that record book, it says that Mordechai saved his life. But there's no reference to Mordechai saving his life until you get to chapter 6 of the Megillah. Chapter 6 of the Megillah, that's after Esther has twice invited the king and Haman to dine with her. And Haman's response is his ego, which is quite large to begin with, is further propped up. That's chapter 5. To the degree that he can't even go to the meal if Mordechai is still alive. He must execute Mordechai immediately. Because after all, how can he insult somebody as important as me? That's what Haman is thinking. That's his thing. That's his response to the double invitation. And chapter 6 begins, and Achashverosh's response is he can't sleep. Something's bothering him. So what does he do? He doesn't like this idea that this other fellow is invited with the queen twice. There's only one king. He's not the king. Why is he invited twice with me? And by the queen, no less. So what does he do? He can't sleep. He's very agitated. And he commands that they bring before him the Sefer HaZichronot, the book of memory. Suddenly, he has a memory. Suddenly, he finds that Mordechai saved his life. It was written in the book the whole time. But that's a book that he'll never pick up because it's the book of IOUs. That's the last thing he wants. But now, when something bothers him, he's bothered by it, and suddenly he discovers that Mordechai saves his life. And of course, if we presume that he knows that Haman is the enemy of Mordechai, then it all makes sense for Achashverosh that Haman's up to no good, and that there's something afoot over here, and he's determined to get rid of Haman. But my point is that the Megillah, which plays off the Joseph story in many, many ways, this is one of the key ways. It's about memory. And it's not an accident that the way the Megillah ends, it tells the story, and then it says, Hayamim la'eleh nizkarim v'nasim b'chol dar v'dar. That this holiday of Purim is remembered. Nizkarim v'nasim. These days are remembered and performed in every generation. V'zichram lo yasuf mizaram. And the memory of what happened will never depart from their ancestors, from their progeny. So the point is, the Megillah makes the point that memory is I would say, a moral obligation. It's not just intellectual, you remember. But to remember things means to make judgments in light of the past, not just to judge at the spur of the moment. Achashverosh is one, of course, because he's completely self-serving. Whatever works for him at that moment. There's no such thing as history, as loyalty, and that stuff doesn't exist for him. Whatever works today, it doesn't matter who it is. It could be Haman, it could be Esther. The person's, identity, morals is completely and totally irrelevant. It's just about what works for me today. And if someone else works better tomorrow, fine. That's the Megillah. But the Megillah ends with the obligation of the Jewish people to remember. These days of Purim are nizkarim v'nasim v'zichram v'yasuf mizaram. That's a very central idea. And in thinking about the centrality of course, the Megillah of memory, we are reminded once again, and we'll come back to this, that memory in the Joseph story is not confined, memory or lack of memory, is not confined to the Sarah Mashkin, hardly, because this idea of memory is central to Joseph. He will name his first son forgetfulness, Menashe. God has enabled me to forget my father's house and my suffering. So we'll see that within the Joseph story, memory plays a very central role. And of course, the things we remember typically are things that really matter to us. If it doesn't matter so much, then we tend not to remember. You can't remember everything. So we have sort of all of us selective memories. But the Sarah HaMashkim, he has no memory except when it serves his own purposes. And actually, in thinking about this, there's actually a wonderful play on words in this verse. Wonderful play on words. Because what did Joseph say to the Sarah Mashkim? He says, you're going to get out in 3 days. And he says to the Sarah Mashkim, Kim zechartani itcha kasher yitavlo. Please remember me unto Pharaoh when it goes well for you. And clearly, when you read that verse in chapter 40, what it means is when it goes well for you, when you get out of jail, you're going to be restored to your post. So it's very good for you. And when you hear the good news, namely, you're restored to your post, at that point, and you'll be so pleased and you'll be so happy that with my prediction, so at that point, it would be appropriate to remember me and to mention me into Paro. Mentioning and remembering is the same word. Hazkir is to mention, Lizkor is to remember. But of course, ironically, when does the Sarah Mashkim tell Paro? kasher yitav lecha, when it's good for him. In other words, when it's good for him, that is to say, when telling is a benefit.
In
But
his
telling
best
in the
interest.
first story is no benefit for him. What does he care? He doesn't benefit by telling Paro. But in the second instance, the kasher yitav lecha is quite literal. It does benefit him. He's the great savior. He's the great hero. He's the one who gave Paro the advice about how he can find somebody to interpret his dreams. I just wanted to repeat that point. And I want to mention one other point, and I'll stop and take comments or questions. And that is that when the Sar HaMashkim speaks to Paro, first Paro addresses the Chartumim and the Chachamim, they can't answer. They can't interpret. And then the Sar HaMashkim speaks up. And he says, I remember my sin, he says, V'sham itanu, and there with us in jail was Nar Eved, Nar Ivri. There was a Hebrew, a young man, a Hebrew, Eved L'Sara Tabachim, a servant to the Sara Tabachim. And I wanted to make the point here that actually when the Sar HaMashkim speaks to Paro, if you had only that verse, there's absolutely no sense, at least I don't detect, that the Sar HaMashkim thinks that Joseph is in jail because Joseph did something wrong. That's not the inference we draw from this verse. It sounds something very different, that the Sar HaMashkim assigned this fellow to us when we were in jail. B'sham itanu, we were both in jail, and the Sar HaMashkim simply assigned one of his servants to take care of us. And when you think about that, it's actually true. Because the Chumash said earlier, if you recall, that Joseph is in jail and finds favor with the chief jailer, with the Sar Beit HaSohar. When these two important people from the government get into the jail, then it says, Vayifkon Sarat HaBachim et Yosef, that the Sarat HaBachim assigned Joseph to these two important officers of Pharaoh's court, the chief baker and chief butler. And there's no sense whatsoever here that, and it actually rings true in the sense, maybe that explains why the Sarat HaBachim didn't just simply do away with Joseph. He doesn't do away with him because Joseph serves a very good purpose. He's the one that will be assigned to these very important people, and his assignment with the Sar HaMashkim and the Sar HaOfim is identical to the assignment that Joseph finds himself performing, carrying out in the beginning of chapter 39 with the Sarat HaBachim. It's exactly the same language. Vayafkei, Vayifkod, it's all the same. So it's interesting that actually it sort of, in a way, sort of strengthens the thought, which I think is good to begin with, that the reason Sarat HaBachim has a use for Joseph. He's an extremely valuable person, and you got to use him for the right job. When you have two big shots come to the jail, that's when he assigns Joseph to these two dignitaries in jail. Okay, that was the first point I wanted to make. We're going to start with Pharaoh's dreams in a moment. Before I do that, are there anybody have any questions or comments here?
I just want to just highlight some stuff from the chat that came up from Neva Goldstein, talking about, Neva, step in if I'm misquoting you, but in the context of the butler talking to Paro. In fact, it could be a deficit for him to remind Paro of his having jailed him.
That's true. It could be. That's why he doesn't mention in the first place. But the deficit is outweighed by the positive. This guy wants help. Paro is very disturbed, and now the butler has a chance to be his helper. The wise men, the people whose job it is to give advice, they can't for whatever reason, they can't give Paro a solution that he likes. In Poter Otam L'Faro, Rashi makes the comment that they offered interpretations, says Rashi, but they were not. Pharaoh didn't see them as beneficial. Namely, you will give birth to 7 children, and 7 children will die. Okay, so net you have 0 basically. It doesn't benefit. It doesn't benefit it doesn't benefit Paro. So what benefits Paro will be Joseph's interpretation, because Joseph's interpretation will demonstrate how the the first part of the dream that we'll get to shortly can be useful to save Paro when the second situation emerges. That's one point. And of course, the main point is he will demonstrate to Paro how Paro can take control of the country, which is why in the first place he has bad dreams, presumably. Something's bothering Paro. Let me just say one last point by way of introduction. What bothers him in the text is very simple. In the previous story, it may have taken place 2 years ago, but it's the previous narrative. In the previous narrative, he is forced to execute the man in charge of the bread. And the man in charge of the bread, substitute for the word bread, say economy. And he doesn't control it because in the baker's dream, the flour was on his head, the birds eat it off his head. Unlike the bowl who places the cup in Pharaoh's palm. The baker is not giving anything to Pharaoh. It's not biyado, and as we've already seen, and we'll see again, the one who has it in his hands is the one who has the power. When Joseph's coat is in Mrs. Potiphar's hand, the yada, we know he's cooked. So it's the question is the baker will put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but the butler, but the baker, the birds eat it off his head. Pharaoh doesn't benefit from that. And therefore, presumably, that's why he has bad dreams. He has bad dreams, something's bothering him, and he can't understand how to solve the problem. And Joseph gives the perfect solution. He understands what's bothering Paro, and he has the perfect answer. I'll explain to you a way that at the same time you can be a big hero and save the nation, and you can also be a hero for yourself and stuff your pockets with all kinds of things. All the money of the people and all of their property and all of their land and all of their cows, etc. At the same time, you will be the one who will deliver Egypt from a potential famine and a terrible famine, and you'll have a way to do it. It's a complete win-win for Pharaoh. So of course, he likes Joseph very much, because Joseph's interpretation is very much poter with Pharaoh, as we'll see. Okay, anybody else for the comment here?
Richard Shore.
Yes, Richard.
So I just wanted to point to one word that supports your interpretation of the Sarah Mashkim's behavior. It's not just lo zachar, but it's vayishkachehu.
Right.
He actively suppressed Yosef. That
Right.
he made a decision not to do it.
That's right, and probably for the reason that we said.
Yeah, for exactly those reasons.
It doesn't benefit him.
Yeah.
The idea of gratitude, the idea of someone helped you out once, that you maybe owe them something or it's the right thing to do. That's a notion that's completely foreign to the Sarah Mashkim. It's foreign to Mitzrayim. That's not the way they function. It's what works for me today, but later on it actually helps them. Okay, why not mention it? Why not mention it? It's interesting that Rashi made the comment. Rashi, according to Medrash, V'shami tanu nar eved ivri, and there was in jail with us a young man, a foreigner, right, and a slave. And Rashi comments, citing the Medrash, cursed are the wicked. Even when they do you a favor, you have to put Joseph down. There was this lowlife in jail, but you know what? He can interpret dreams. So it's all about, of course, what they're getting. It's all about the Sarah Mashkim. But when it's not going to help him, he even suppresses it by Yishkacheyu, which is the last word of chapter 40. Okay, so now we can continue with our story, chapter 41.
Can
Yes.
I ask you one more question?
Go right ahead.
It's always bothered me that Pasuk Yud Gimel and Pasuk Yud Tet in Perek Mem are so similar. When he speaks to the Sar Hamashkim and he tells him what's going to happen, and when he speaks
Yes. Just sound a little cruel to you, in other words. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Now, I don't even know if he spoke in Hebrew, but the way the Torah reports it,
Right.
it's
It's
almost
not
the
Roshecha.
same. And
You
it
lift up your head
seems,
or lift off your head, basically, what it comes down to.
yes,
To raise your head means to give you a position of importance, but to remove your head means to execute you. And
yes,
the two words are the same. I presume that what it has to do is the Torah wants to reinforce the idea that Joseph's genius in this case is his ability to distinguish the two different people. Of course, On the surface, when you start reading chapter 40, what it sounds like is that the two of them together plotted or did something wrong against the king. They sinned against the king in some way. It sounds like together. Chatu mashkem. Anybody who reads it would assume the two of them together. And even when the Sarah Mashkim speaks, Paro kotzaf al avodav, Paro got angry against his servants. It sounds like it wasn't just one day the wine was spoiled or the bread was burnt. It sounds like there's much more to it than that, especially if we assume that they are people of great significance in the government. It's the Sarah Mashkim, the Sarah Ophim, Sarah Tabakim. The Sarah Tabakim has a jail in his house. So the point is, I think it's a way to reinforce in chapter 40, two people come, they come together, they're there for similar reasons, they have dreams on the same night. The dreams are somewhat similar, and the genius of Joseph is his ability to distinguish the two. They're different. Unlike Bigtan and Teresh in the book of Esther, they're together. But over here, there's a difference, and it sets up chapter 41, because in chapter 41, one of the questions with Pharaoh's dreams is going to be, is it one dream or two dreams? It would appear that the wise men and the magicians think it's two dreams, but what Yosef says, at least in chapter 41, is it's one dream. Chalom paro echadu. That's very central to his interpretation. So in order to reinforce that they're similar in chapter 40, the Torah uses the same language for both. It's my take on it. It's a good observation. Okay, let us now continue with chapter 41, Miketz. Because Vehi Miketz Shnatayim Yamim, Paro Choleim, V'nei Omed HaYar. This is a long chapter. We're obviously not going to finish it all now, but let's begin. So now we have more dreams. Miketz Shnatayim Yamim, the Rashbam points out that when it says Shnatayim Yamim, it means 2 full years. So there were 2 full years. It means that Joseph is in jail for 2 full years. He might have been in jail more than 2 full years, but Miketz Shnatayim Yamim, it sounds like maybe 2 years after the Sarah Mashkim got out. Well, who knows what it is? But the point is, it's 2 full years. And now we have more dreams. We had 2 dreams of Joseph. We have the 2 dreams of the Sarah Mashkim and the Sarah Ophim. And now we're going to have Pharaoh's dreams. In Pharaoh's dreams, he's standing by the Nile. Now, the word Ya'ar, which appears in many places in the Bible, but Al HaYa'ar, the Ya'ar is clearly the main river of Egypt, which is the Nile, obviously. So he's standing by the main body of water, HaYa'ar. But the word Ya'ar is a very interesting word. The Ramban, in his commentary, suggests that the word Ya'ar is related to the word Or, light. Talks about the rain as somehow the light falling from heaven. He has a verse in Eov to that effect. But let's just bear that in mind, that the word Ya'ar, which clearly refers to the Nile, but perhaps a suggestion in the Chumash that it's also related to the word Or. That is an interesting suggestion of the Ramban, and we should keep it in the back of our heads, because it may come up on more than one occasion. See how the Chumash plays with this idea. So in the dream, he's standing by the Nile, and now v'nei ben hayar olot sheva parot yefot mareu briot basar. Walking out of the Nile. Now you remember that the Nile in Egypt is basically the source of the economy, because Egypt doesn't, unlike the land of Israel, it doesn't really depend on the rain. The Nile, which is the biggest river in the world, there's typically water in the Nile. It's under only those unusual circumstances that Egypt would have a famine, which is why in the Torah, when there's a famine, you go down to Egypt. Because, right, Abraham went down to Egypt. It sounds like Isaac was on the way down to Egypt. This week's parsha, God stops him, because there's water there. It's not like the land of Canaan, where there's not always water. It depends on the rain, not in Egypt. So the economy is rooted in the Nile. And out of the Nile step 7 cows. Yefot mareu briot basar. So they're healthy cows, pretty cows, healthy cows. And they batirena ba'achu. And they grazed. Achu, according to most of the commentaries, is a place of grass. Maybe various types of grass. The Ramban suggests maybe it's more than one type. Probably by the side of the river. That's how Rashi understands. That's how the Ramban understands it, and the Rashbam, etc. So they're standing there, ba'achu. V'nei sheva parot acherot, and now it's 7 additional cows. Olot achreihem min hayar, they follow them. Ra'ot mareh v'dakot basar, They look bad, ra'ot mareh, and they sin. V'tamona eisel haparot asvat, and they stand next to the first set of 7. V'tochalna haparot ra'ot hamareh v'dakot habaraseret sheva haparot yafot hamareh v'abriot v'ikatz paro. So in this dream, which is rather striking, the 7 lean cows swallow up the 7 healthy cows. That's all it says over here. At which point Paro wakes up from this dream. Maybe he sees it as a nightmare. That's the dream. And now, Vayishon vayachalom shenit, he goes back to sleep. Vayishon, he goes back to sleep. And he has another dream. There's another dream. V'nei sheva shiborim alot b'konei echad briot v'tovot. So here in this second dream, which is parallel to the first dream, there were 7 ears of grain, solid and healthy, growing on a stalk, konei echad. And then, v'nei sheva shiborim dakot ushtufot kodim samchot achrehen, and afterwards there are 7 more sheaves, which are sin, shtufot kodim, blasted by the east wind. They sprout up after them. Vativlana shiborim adakot sheva shiborim abriot v'atamreyot, and the 7 lean or gaunt stalks swallow up the healthy and the full stalks. Vayikatz paro v'nei chalom, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, a dream. By the way, notice is the language in. By the way, the language in the Joseph narrative, I must say this, is unlike. Is just the language and the way the stories are told. The detail is very different from the rest of Genesis. It has a completely different feel to it. Maybe we'll come back to this point. What to make of it is a good question. It has a different feel to it. Now, here's a word that appears many, many times in the Joseph story in these chapters. The word is hine. Many times. Hine, right? Hine min hayar. V'hine sheva parot achirot, right? And later on, v'hine sheva shibolim. V'hine sheva shibolim dakot ushtufot, right? Vayikatz paro v'hine chalo. So the word hine will appear over and over again, and often the word hine appears in dream stories. Hine carries with it a sense often of the unexpected, the unusual, unexpected. So these are the dreams of Pharaoh, and they are rather striking dreams. And one of the questions when you read it, is it one dream or 2? It's a very good question. From one perspective, it's 2 dreams, because it says he woke up the first time. And often you have a dream, you can wake up from a bad dream, go back to sleep. Usually it's not the case you have the same dream. Usually you have a different dream or no dream or whatever it is. But in this particular case, he wakes up, and the second dream is very similar to the first dream. So now the question is it 1 or is it 2? That's a very important question. So let's just read it. We'll see a couple more verses. Vahi baboker, vatipoyem lucho. In the morning, vatipoyem lucho. So vatipoyem is a word that does not appear that often. Here my translation says his spirit was agitated. It's a good enough translation as any. He's very bothered. Vayishrach vayikro et kol chartumei mitzrayim ve'kol chachamera. He summons for the chartumim, or the magicians, and the wise men of Egypt. Vayisaper paro lahem et chalomo v'yein poter otam lefaro. Notice the second half of this verse. Notice the right. Vayisaper paro lahem et chalomo. Pharaoh told him his dream. Chalomo, singular. V'yein poter otam lefaro, but none could interpret them. So Pharaoh presenting it as one dream, but they couldn't interpret them. Apparently, they considered the 2 dreams to be 2 separate dreams. So that's the question. Is it 1 dream or is it 2? Joseph will make a big deal out of the fact in this chapter that it's 1 dream. It is clearly, however, in the Chumash to be understood in addition as 2 dreams, and we'll get to that. But before I mention all that, we'll get to it today and later. But I did want to mention one thing I saw in the Ramban, which I thought was very interesting. The Ramban thinks that fundamentally it's 1 dream. It's 1 dream with 2 parts because he goes back to sleep. But the Ramban thinks that the first dream is about the cows, the healthy cows, the lean cows, etc. As the second is about the sheaves. So the Ramban's understanding of the dreams is that fundamentally they're along the same line. The cows, the Ramban suggests, cows were used in the ancient world often for, typically, for working in the field, for plowing. What we call in Hebrew charish. And the second part of the dream, the stalks, that's what you reap. That's kotzir. Charish v'kotzir. Term charish v'kotzir, b'kotzir, b'charish v'kotzir tishbot, the Torah said on Bat Shabbat. You should refrain from working charish and kotzir. Charish being the first act you do towards gathering in the crop, and the harvesting of the crop, the reaping, is the last thing. So there's charish v'kotzir. That's how the Ramban understands the cows and the stalks. Basically, it's one thing. It's the production of, it's food production, which begins with the plowing and concludes with the reaping. That's the Ramban. Having said that, so fundamentally, it's one idea, the Ramban thinks. On the other hand, he came in two different stages, because he had one dream, went back to sleep, and the second dream was after he had gone back to sleep a second time. So in any event, the Ramban's point, whether it's true or not, I couldn't say, but the Ramban's point speaks to what I mentioned before, namely, why does Paro have bad dreams? Like we ask in the Megillah, I ask, why can't Achashverosh sleep at night? We can't sleep at night in chapter 6 because he's bothered by something. And what bothers these people typically is there's someone else who may be angry on me and maybe on my queen and trying to get power. Why is this queen inviting this guy to meet with me as an equal on 2 occasions? That's what keeps kings up at night. Can't sleep. He's got to find the answer. He's got to go through the record book. What do we know about Haman? Nothing. What do we know about Haman's enemy, Mordechai? Plenty. It's written down in the books. So he accidentally, but not accidentally, finds it. He's looking for it. So that's the point over here. The point over here, as I mentioned earlier, was in the previous chapter, chapter 40, ends with the execution of the baker, the chief baker. Execution of the chief baker, man in charge of the lechem, right? Means that Paro is not in control of the lechem. And here we come to a very important point about Joseph's ability to interpret dreams. And the reason Joseph can interpret Paro's dreams very simply and very easily is because Joseph had exactly the same dreams. He was 17 years old. Remember his first dream. We're standing in a field. We're gathering in the wheat, ma'almim ma'alumim, and your sheaves, we're gathering in the sheaves, and your sheaves bow down to my sheaf. He didn't say you bow down to me. He said your sheaf bows down to my sheaf. Because what Joseph understands from day one, even as a kid he understood this, that the person who controls all the sheaves is the person to whom you have to bow down, which of course is a wonderful introduction to the story of Joseph and his brothers. Why do they bow down to Joseph at first, not knowing it's Joseph? They bow down to Joseph because he has all the food. If you want the food, you have to acknowledge the man in charge of the food. So the point is that the lechem, being in charge of the lechem, is the key to power. Because if you have all the lechem, you can do what Joseph does. You can charge an exorbitant price. So that after 1 year, and you know it's going to be a 7-year famine. After 1 year, the Torah will tell us later in chapter 47, that people come to Joseph for food. And after 1 year, they say to Joseph, we have no more money. We have no money. So Joseph, will you take our cattle? Okay, we'll take your cattle for Pharaoh. Why not? But why don't they have money? Because he's charging a price, a high price. So there's no money. So after 1 year, the money is gone. Give me your cattle. After 2 years, the cattle are gone. Give me means give Paro. Give Paro your land. And of course, as I pointed out many times, those are the 2 dreams of Pharaoh. The first dream is about the cattle, and the second is about the land. And the person who's going to make it in Pharaoh's court is the person who is able to deliver everything to Pharaoh. First, the money, that will run out very quickly because of the high price. And then the cattle, that's his first dream. And then the sheaves and the land, that's the second dream. The one who's going to make it in Egypt is going to be Joseph. No one is wiser than you, Joseph. You figured it all out. How I can simultaneously be a hero for saving Egypt, and at the very same time, can essentially expropriate almost everything they have and put it under my control. That's the genius of Joseph. Now, one, of course, can raise the question, which we can deal with, and we'll deal with it, about the morality of such behavior. It's a good question. The Chumash does have a critique of Joseph, I believe. On the other hand, the Egyptian people say, you have kept us alive. He does save the Egyptian people. You got to deal with Paro. You know, if you go to Paro and say, Paro, I suggest you give a very significant gift to the Egyptian people, you know, you're headed back to jail, no doubt. That's not in the cards. That's not the way they function. So Joseph does figure out a way to simultaneously make Paro very happy and empower Paro, give him total control. But at the same time, the people will say to Joseph, you have kept Happy Itano, you kept us alive. I think the morality of it is a very good question, and one that the Chumash, it's not that we're raising the question. The Chumash raises the question, I believe, as we'll see. But it is a good question. Not that we can't raise questions, but I think the question is already embedded in the Torah. The Torah is bothered to some degree by what Joseph is doing, as we'll get to later on. Anyway, that's the point. So the point is, the one who's going to make Pharaoh happy, the one who's going to give power to Pharaoh is the one that Paro is going to give him a certain amount of power. Same thing was true in the house of Potiphar. Every time Joseph does something, Potiphar benefits. Every time Potiphar benefits, he gets another promotion. He's in charge of his personal valet, then in charge of the house, then in charge of the fields, then a blank check. Why? Because it's to Potiphar's benefit. He has this great guy who gives him everything. Why not? But when you cross Potiphar, you end up in the jail. And the same thing is true of Pharaoh. As long as you give Pharaoh what Pharaoh wants, you're the great hero. But the moment, if that moment comes, and you know what, it always comes, when suddenly you can't give Paro anymore, either because you don't have the ability to give more, or because he already has it all. Either way, and suddenly you are in deep trouble because he doesn't need you anymore. And the moment he doesn't need you anymore, you discover what you actually are in Mitzrayim, which is a slave. That's the story of Joseph. We'll get to it. In any event, this is what the Megillah understood very well, but it's all in the Chumash. As long as you help Paro out, you're going to be good. The other interpretation said Rashi didn't help him out. 7 children live, 7 children die. Net is 0. How does that help Paro? Joseph will help Paro, because you have to understand how to use the 7 good years as Joseph will explain. So before I continue, if any comments or questions, I'll take it briefly, and then we will move on to finish as far as we can go.
I just want to highlight.
Yes?
From Devi Sondheim, who, please correct me if I get the Hebrew wrong, does the word bachu appear anywhere else? Devi, can you give me an assist?
Which
Does that
verse?
appear anywhere else? At the beginning, ba'achu.
I believe it appears in the Eov. I have to check that. I believe the word, it's a poetic word. I think it's in the Eov. I'll check it out. It's a rare word. It doesn't appear in the Chumash anyplace. The Ramban thinks it's connected to the word achva. The Ramban thinks different plants, different kinds of plants that grow together. I don't know, but it's a word that appears in, I believe it's in the Eov.
Thank you.
I believe so, but I couldn't cite the verse for you right now. I'll take a look. It's an unusual word, no doubt. Okay, let us now continue. Fine. So now we're up to verse number 14. We'll go straight now. Vayishlach Paro vayikra et Yosef vayiritzu min habar. Vayigalach vayichalef simlotav vayavo el Paro. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, the same way he had called for his magicians. Now we vayishlach vayikra, exactly the same words. Vayiritzu min habar, they rushed him out of the jail. He shaved and he changed his clothing, and he stood before Paro. So a couple of comments. First, I'll make the obvious point that we all see. once again, Joseph is changing his clothing. And not only that, is he changing his clothing once again, but also Vayigalach, he's also shaving, which I presume is not the standard for the Jewish men, because later in the Chumash, in Vayikra, for example, certain people have to shave their body hair, their heads, whatever it is. Those are unusual situations, change of status, mitzorah, but the presumption is that you don't have giluach. But in Pharaoh's court, apparently, Vayigalach, Vayichalef, Shemotov, so he's already standing before Paro with different clothing that's appropriate for Paro and with the shaving that presumably is an Egyptian practice. Later on, we'll encounter other Egyptian practices in the story of Joseph, the embalming and all that. We'll get to it later on. But once again, Joseph has a new set of clothing and he stands before Paro. Now there's something else here, which is very interesting. And of course, the Megillah picks it up and runs with it, literally. And that is the verb vayiritzuhu. He sent for Joseph and they rushed him out of the pit. And this is a theme in the Joseph story and a central theme in the Megillah. And the question is what to make of it. Here's a guy who's languishing in jail. And he doesn't belong in jail. He, as he says, he was innocent. Okay, he's in jail. And then he tries to get out of jail. And a few days later, doesn't work because the Sarah Mashkim forgets him. Doesn't remember, he forgets him, puts him out of his mind. Could be there for suddenly, 2 years later, what do you know? Suddenly, he's summoned by Pharaoh. And notice, now as he's summoned by Pharaoh, they rush him out of the pit. So the way that the Chumash and the book of Esther plays with time is very interesting. Plays with time. He languishes, and all of a sudden, zoom. You have this later in the Joseph story as well. When Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers, he says, I'm Joseph, don't take it so badly, it's all God's plan. Maharu va'alu alavi, hurry up and run to my father and tell him your son Joseph is alive. And he ends his speech in chapter 40, umihartem, hurry up and bring my father down. One might say to Joseph, your father's been mourning you for the last 20 years, right? Now you're in a rush. But what's interesting is that the Joseph story is that way. Nothing happens, and all of a sudden, and the same thing is true, of course, in the Megillah. Haman is moving very nicely, and suddenly everything goes wrong. And suddenly we have the verbs maru et Haman, hurry, right, to the parties. Rush Haman to the party. Rush Haman off to say, vayavhilu lavi et Haman. So the Megillah has the same kind of sense. And the idea of it, I think, perhaps, is that if one sees in the Joseph story, leaving the Megillah out, but one sees in the Joseph story sort of the hand of God. God has a plan. And when God wants to act upon God's plan, all of a sudden, everything falls in place and everything is rushing to a conclusion. Prior to that, nothing happens. He languishes in jail. For all Joseph knows, he'll never get out. But all of a sudden, he's rushed off to Paro. Paro needs him now. It's part of the same thinking. I need you now. So, I need you now. When do you need me? Come to my office in 30 minutes. Ever had those conversations? I've had them. Suddenly you can't get a hold of them. But suddenly they need you for something. Then there's a big rush. That's the way it works. So, and now he stands before Paro. Vayoma Paro Yosef, Chalom chalamti ufoterin oto. Vani shamati olecha leimor tishma chalom liftar oto. I have a dream. No one could interpret my dream. I heard about you, that you can hear a dream and you know how to interpret it. Now the question is what Joseph responds to that. This is one of those verses you can say many things about. Vayan Yosef et Paro leimor biladai. Elohim yaneh et shalom Paro. Now the question is how to interpret this verse. Joseph said to Paro, not me, not I. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. There are several things to say about this verse. Before we get to the question about what is Joseph really after, I'm not sure we can come to a specific conclusion here. But what is interesting before we get there is the statement, Elohim Yaneh et Shalom Paro. What Joseph is picking up over here, and maybe the fact that he was rushed, is what the Chumash said earlier. Batipayim Rucho. You're talking about somebody who's very agitated. He's extremely, the dreams upset him for some reason. He doesn't understand it, but something about the dreams is very troubling to Paro. And when Joseph says, God will answer, Yanet Shalom Paro, God's gonna take care of you. God's gonna see to your welfare. That's the first thing he says. So he already understands that Joseph is very intuitive here. He understands it's not just about a particular dream. It's something troubling Paro. That's the first point. Now the question is, what do we make of this statement? Not me, but God will solve your problem. The same thing he said in the previous chapter. He saw the baker and the butler. He said to them, they said, we had a dream. We have dreams, And Joseph says, and they're very upset. The same thing. Why are you so upset? What's bothering you? We had these dreams. The dreams trouble them. And Joseph said, Halo Elohim Pitronim Sapurnoli. God can interpret dreams. Tell me your dreams. So what does that mean? God can interpret your dreams. Tell me your dreams. Not me, he says to Pharaoh. It's God. What does that mean? So I'll suggest two alternatives to understand that. One is, listen, I'll give it my best shot. At the end of the day, only God can truly interpret the dream. You ask me to do it, I may have some ability, but listen, at the end of the day, it's God who's going to be trying to help you. In other words, what you can read it as a way Joseph is saying, listen, I'm going to try to help you, but if I can't help you, don't blame me because nobody can help you, because only God can, or is he saying something different? It's not me, but God means in effect, no, it's not me. It's not me that I have this great ability. It's just so happens that God speaks through me. So from Pharaoh's perspective, he's probably thinking, I don't really care if it's you or it's God. I just want to understand it. But when Joseph says, it's not me, but it's God, if we understand it to mean it's God who works through Joseph, that will have many, many, I think, implications as far as Joseph's status with Paro. And we'll get to this later on. Because remember, at the end of the day, Joseph is the Ivri. He's the outsider. He's the stranger. And we know the Egyptians don't like strangers. We already saw that with Mrs. Potiphar in the house. We know they eat separately. We know they're the ones from the other side. So if Paro wants to promote Joseph, he's going to have to figure out a way to promote this fellow, despite the fact that he is the Ivri. That's going to be a major problem for Paro. How do you present this Hebrew to the Egyptian people as your boss, essentially, as the second in command, the vice president, as it were? So we'll see. That's an issue Paro has to deal with, and we'll see how he does that. He does it in a variety of ways. But meanwhile, Joseph's statement is very interesting, and it could be that he actually believes this, and it could even be true, actually. God doesn't work through Joseph. Joseph is there in Egypt to do God's work. That's what Joseph says to his brothers on at least 2 occasions. It's not about me. God works through Joseph. So this is the question we'll have to deal with, and because it's pretty basic, It says a lot about Joseph, and it says a lot about the story. So let's just keep that in mind as we move forward. Okay, just take a couple more verses here, and then I'll stop, take comments, questions, whatever. Fine. So, right now we have Paro tells his dream. Beginning in verse 17, Paro tells his dream. Now, what's interesting to note about Paro's telling of the dream is that the language is not identical to the language that we saw earlier in the Chumash. Some of the language is different. And secondly, what's interesting is that you have within the retelling of Paro's dream statements that are not in the dream at all, would appear to be Paro's take on the dream. For example, when Paro describes the describes the two dreams. I'm standing by the side of the Yor, right? And the healthy cows come out. And in verse number 19, V'nei sheva parot acherot olot achrehen, dalot v'rot toar ma'od v'rakot bosar. Okay, he uses different language, but they're weak, they're thin, they're gaunt. Then he adds, Lo ra'iti kahena b'chol eretz Mitzrayim lo roa. I've never seen in all my life in the land of Egypt such sickly-looking animals. Now that's his own statement. That's his own observation about the dream. It's not about what he saw in the dream. He described what he saw. He saw these lean, thin, gaunt, or sickly cows. But he describes. That's one place where he adds something, or the Chumash tells us what he's thinking. And the second place is in verse number 24. After the parot eat up, the sickly ones eat up the healthy ones, verse number 21, Vatavona el kirbena, v'lo noda ki bo el kirbena, u'marehen ra kasher batchila v'ikatz. That we don't have. That after the lean cows eat up the healthy ones, they don't look any better than they did before. They still look lean. That's not in the original dream. That's what Paro tells. So there are two things that Paro tells Joseph in the repetition of the dreams, apart from some differences in language. But there are two statements that simply don't appear the first time. One is what he's thinking. I haven't seen such terrible cows. And the second one, which is very striking, is that after the lean cows eat up the fat ones, they're just as lean as they were before. We'll have to come back to that point. Presumably, it's an important point because it's something that we didn't know before about the dream, and now we're told it for the first time. That's the first half. And now the second half is, in verse number 22, so he repeats his dreams. I went to the Chartumim. He doesn't mention the Chachamim. The Chartumim may be on a higher plane. They couldn't explain it to me. No one could tell me the dream. And now just one more verse. Vayomer Yosef el Paro, Chalom Paro echadu. Et asher hu Elohim oseh higid leFaro. And here we have a critical point about Joseph's interpretation. His first point is the two dreams are one dream. They're one dream. And now the question is, well, if the two dreams are one dream, let's leave out the Ramban, or maybe even with the Ramban, that plowing and harvesting. But if the two dreams are one, then the question is, why do you need two dreams? If the dreams are a repetition, why do you need the second dream? So Joseph's response, I think, is Et asher Elohim oseh higid leFaro, that the reason there are two dreams over here, which essentially are parallel dreams, is because there's a message that God is trying to give you, and God wants to make sure you get the message. And the reason for that is because the urgency of the message, that's point number one. But then what Joseph says later, which is very important, he says in verse number 28, after he explains what the 7 cows, will come back to it, the 7 years, etc., years of plenty, years of famine. Hu hadavar shedibarti el Paro, asher Elohim oseh herod Paro. God is showing Paro what is going to happen in the future. And then Joseph explains it. We'll come back to that next time. And then in verse number 32, V'yal hishanot hachalom el Paro pamayim. And the reason that the dream appears twice, why did God repeat the dream? The answer is, Ki nachon hadavar mi'el Elohim u'memaher Elohim lasoto. A critical point. The reason it appears twice, says Joseph, is because what God is saying to you is, first God's telling you, what God's giving you information, Paro. That means God's imploring you to do something. But the second point, and when I talk about the 7 years of famine, 7 years of plenty, and the 7 years of famine, what God is saying by repeating the message is it's happening now. starting today. Tomorrow morning, everything's going to be different, a different economy tomorrow morning. And that leads into the next point of Joseph, which is, therefore, he says to Paro, find a wise person to govern your affairs. Find a wise person to govern your affairs, I believe, is not Joseph giving advice to Paro. What's the Hebrew slaves giving advice to Paro? He might give advice to the self-serving advice to the butler in jail. That's one thing. Butler's a prisoner. But you don't give advice to Paro. He's not giving advice to Paro. He's interpreting his dream. This is what it is. God speaks to you. Let's start with that. God speaks to you. Through me, but God's speaking to you. And God's telling you what's going to be in the future, Paro. You got to deal with it. That's why God's telling you. And not only that, God's telling you, deal with it immediately. And therefore, you got to find someone now. There's no time for a job search for the next 18 months to find somebody. You need someone today. Now, of course, that may be completely self-serving. Okay, it is. So what? Yes, Joseph is angling to get this job because, first of all, he would prefer not to be returned to the jail. Let's start with that. And second of all, he is eminently qualified and he is an ambitious person. He did dream as a child, the sun and moon and stars bow down to him. So he doesn't lack for ambition. And here you have a chance to be an important person in the court of Pharaoh. How important, even Joseph probably didn't see that much. But this is the point. The advice he gives to Paro, in my opinion, is not simply advice. It's interpretation. It's a function of the fact that God is trying to get this message through. It's got it now. You got to hear this now. I'll say it once and I'll say it again. Says Joseph, therefore, God is telling you, you must choose someone immediately. And Joseph then lays out what this person is going to do. And that we'll pick up next week, because what the person is going to do, essentially, is to make Paro all-powerful and to remove the problem that existed with the Sar Hofi, with the chief baker. Namely, the chief baker wasn't putting any bread on Paro's table. Says Joseph, but I know how to put a lot of bread on your table. I know how to give you utter and complete control of Mitzrayim. It's very simple. He says it makes it very, and he uses the key word in the Joseph story we've come across. Everything should be, during the years of plenty, you're going to ration off a lot of the food, place it in store cities, Tachat Yad Paro, under the Yad of Paro. Remember, we've seen Yad in the Joseph story throughout. The one who has the Yad, who has the upper hand, who has control, is the one that has power. Poti put everything into Joseph's hand, but then he put his coat into her hand, and he finds himself gone. Then in jail, it's in Joseph's hand again. The Sarah Mashkin places the cup in Pharaoh's hand, and Joseph knows how to put Egypt into Pharaoh's hand. It's very simple. Years of plenty, tremendous plenty. Take most of the crop under your control. And then when the famine comes to Egypt and beyond, nobody has food. Only one person has food. Under lock and key, stored, guarded, Shamaru with his guards, armed guards, guarding Pharaoh's food. Whoever wants food has only one place to go, to Paro. And therefore, you can charge whatever you want and you can take whatever you want, because the alternative is utter starvation. That's Joseph's advice. Of course, when Paro hears this, and my argument is they understand each other perfectly well. And of course, the one who is able to hand over to Paro, literally put it into Paro's hands, is the one that Paro will favor and give him a lot of control. And I'll conclude with simply reading. We'll go back to this next week. But I'll simply read 2 verses. Paro is very taken with Joseph. And of course, he wants Joseph to take the job. And the Torah says that later on, Vayasar Paro et tabato me'al yado, vayitain ota al yad Yosef. So Pharaoh took the ring on his own hand, took off his ring, the tabat of the king, the Megillah place with the tabat of the king, the seal of the king, right? He takes the ring off his own hand and he puts it on Joseph's hand. Now, he makes the statement to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and only I am above you. So he makes it very clear to Pharaoh, to Joseph, exactly where Joseph stands. You have this, you're the second, you're the Mishnah. But it is striking that Pharaoh gives Joseph his ring. One might think, if you're Joseph, one might be misled into thinking that you are more powerful than Pharaoh. He gave me his ring. And in fact, we have reason to believe that at some point Joseph actually thought that, a grievous mistake. But the point is, given the fact that we've encountered the word Yad over and over again, as the one who has the power and the control, it's very striking that Pharaoh took the ring off his finger and placed it on Joseph's hand. But of course, at the end of the day, the food, Joseph may dole out the food, but the food is Tachat Yad Paro, Ochel Be'arim V'Shamaru. We have over here a most interesting situation, which I think we have to talk about that. About, the Torah is bothered by this. There's no question about it. And it's something really to think about. More broadly, I think, more broadly, I flew back from Israel this morning. I got back about 5 o'clock in the morning, whatever. Sat next to this guy. I wouldn't give the whole story, but he had these magazines with him. And I sort of out of the Haredi world. So I read a couple of things. They had a very long article about this guy Kastner. About Kastner during the war. He cooperated with the Nazis. He also saved the Kastner train. And this article is a long article about Kastner. It took a very dim view, a negative view of Kastner. But the truth about it is, Kastner is an extreme case, and I reserve judgment. I don't know. But I think it raises, in a very striking way, and a very important question that the Joseph story raises, which is, when you cooperate in life, you often cooperate with bad people. And you do that because you need to do it at the time. I mean, the United States was on the same side as Joseph Stalin in the Second World War. Can't get much worse, but the other guy was even worse. So the point is, the Joseph story raises that interesting question. You want to do good, you want to save the people, you want to give them food. Maybe the only way to do it is to give the Pharaoh really ultimate power. And at the end of the day, when you give someone power and he has 98% power, he typically wants to get 99 or 100%. The Jews are all that's left, basically, once he gives power all the power. And the Chumash is well aware of this, as we'll see. So I think something to think about as we proceed through the Joseph story. I'll stop at this point. Very last comments or questions. You have a couple of minutes.
All right. I just want to highlight a few questions from that came up in chat and then open up the floor. Justin Hornstein points out that the Egyptian hierarchy shaved body hair largely to remove lice, and that he says, I think Joseph's shaving might have been utilitarian.
It could be. It may be utilitarian, but the point is the Chumash goes out of its way to mention it. And it mentions it in the context of changing clothing. The point is, and this is a very important point, actually. I'll come back to this point. Can't do it all. My point about Joseph is, in regarding to the shaving, when you want to work for the king, if you want to work for Achashverosh, okay? You want to work for Pharaoh. You can't be a Jew working for Pharaoh. You got to be an Egyptian working for Pharaoh. Joseph will end up marrying the daughter of an Egyptian priest. He will change his name. He's not Joe anymore, right? He's Tzafnat Paner, which is clearly Tzafnat Paner, leaving the drushes out of it. Baal Tzafon is an Egyptian god. He's not Joseph. He's some other name, an Egyptian name. And he's got an Egyptian wife, and she's a daughter of a priest. Okay, and he's Egyptian clothing, and he travels in the chariot, right? The Rechev is a symbol of Egypt. You can't, and the father's name is Potiphera. Same name as Potiphar, right? The point is, it's not Potiphar, but the point is, you can't, if you're going to work for Pharaoh in a high post, you can't be a Jew. That's the point of the Chumash. And one way or another, he demands that you be the Egyptian. It's a demand. It's not a choice. Yeah, you can go back to jail. That's possible. But if you want to work with Paro on that level, there's no way to avoid it. So the shaving is important. Doesn't matter why they do it. Actually, that's irrelevant. But what's relevant is that when he comes before Paro, he's no longer just Joseph the Jew. There's no Tonet Pasim. He's going to dress the way you dress in the court of Paro, if he wants to stay there. He could go back to oblivion, but he doesn't want to go back to oblivion. And that's the point. And we'll get to this point. It's a very deep point, and the Megillah understood it very well, because they have the same thing in the Megillah. One thing, if you have to bow down to Haman. If you're living in Shushan, you have to, only people in the gate have to bow down to Haman. But Mordechai put himself in the gate. You're in the gate, you have no choice. He has to call attention to himself, but if they find out, you're in trouble. Because that the closer you are to the king, the more the king demands. Well, what else? What other comments do you have there?
I just have one more comment, and then Jerome. Niva said, any significance to Vayipaim having the shorsh of Pa'am, time?
Yes, there is. Well, I'll talk about that maybe next week or 2 weeks. I believe there is a significance.
All right. Jerome?
Yeah,
I haven't worked it all out, but the Joseph story has some very unique features too. I mentioned in the beginning, the Joseph story sounds different than the rest of Bereshit. There's certain features in the Joseph story, things that appear, I don't fully understand them myself, but I'm sensitive to it. There's certain things that appear over and over again. They're very curious. Now, in that context, I'll talk about Tipa and Rucha. I'll talk about that. What else?
Yeah, David, does Joseph really need to hear Pharaoh's dreams in order to say what he subsequently says? He doesn't even need to hear the dreams. You know, I compare the beginning of the book of Daniel, where Daniel gives an explanation without hearing the dreams.
That's true. That is unusual in Nebuchadnezzar's case. I'm not going to tell you my dream, he says. That's unusual. But the book of Bereshit has, the dreams tell us, look, the dreams tell us what Paro is thinking about in general, which is not a surprise. But as I intimated, it also is a blueprint for what's going to happen later. Dreams of the cows and the land are exactly what Joseph's going to deliver to Paro later. And my claim is that the fix is in from the very beginning. Those are the conditions under which Joseph gets the job. He gets the job because Paro understands this is a bright guy who's going to be able to do what I want to do. It's my dreams, right? That's the point. Something is bothering him. God will solve Yishlom Paro. He's agitated by Tipar and Rucho. And that's what Joseph picks up. It's very intuitive. Joseph picks up something's bothering this guy, and the one who's going to succeed is the one who deals with his anxiety. And what is the anxiety coming out of? I claim it's coming out of his lack of control. It's coming out of the fact that the Sarah Ophim has just been executed. It's a lack of control. Kings want control. And the one who's going to figure out a way to give him control will succeed. And the genius of Joseph is to figure out in a way that also benefits the nation. It doesn't not benefit the nation. It comes at a cost, but it does benefit the people. Otherwise they can't survive. He has this plan, and he understood the economics when he was 17 years old, because that's his own dream. That's my point. But we'll get to all these things. It's a complicated story. There's all kinds of stuff. Okay, I think I'll stop at this point then.
Can I read something? Very
Yes.
short.
Sorry, I do need to cut off this stream as we have a class starting up in about 10 minutes. And I don't want to run things over too much.
But this,
I'm sorry,
comment?
Sarah.
What's the last comment?
I just wanted to say that maybe Joseph's story is different, even linguistically, because it's the first Egyptian story.
That is certainly a possibility. Well, we'll have to think about why. I'm not sure about why. I'm not even 100% understanding what. But I have an intuition about it. I want to point out a couple of things about the Joseph story that strike me as unique, actually. I don't think it appears elsewhere in Bereshit. It's a very, very complicated story. But we'll deal with this next week, 2 weeks, etc. as we go through Bereshit. The goal is to finish Bereshit this year. That's the goal. So
Thank you, Rabbi.
now. Okay, I'll stop at this point.
Very
Then.
interesting.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We have
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Todorov.